We've been looking at the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, and now we will look at the drama of her downward spiral to self-destruction. First, let's set the stage. After the rebellion, Mary's feelings for Darnley turned from dislike to outright disgust. At one point, she even considered killing him, or at least divorcing him, but she couldn't go through with it because of their son, James. And as time passed, Mary sank deeper into depression. In that darkness, she found herself fantasizing about turning back time, going back to life before she married him. She cried constantly. She told her servants over and over again that she wanted to die. Her depression grew so severe that she lost interest in everything, her power, her wealth, even her own child, James. And when her hatred for Darnley boiled over, she began to obsess over the idea of having him executed. But of course, that was impossible. She had to think of her son, James. Mary had all but given up on separating from Darnley. But then, she wasn't entirely alone. There were people who were willing to help her, and one man had the power and the ability to do it. The Earl of Bothwell. Now, we already mentioned Bothwell in a previous video as Mary's fiercely loyal supporter. From a young age, he had served Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, fighting fiercely against the rising Protestant factions. But he was eventually defeated by the pro-English Protestant Earl of Moray and forced into exile in France. But court life in France didn't suit him. Bothwell was a manly man to his core. Sitting in court and flirting with noble women bored him to death. What he really wanted was to return to Scotland and ride into battle. And soon his chance came. Right after Mary married Darnley, her half-brother Moray launched a rebellion. That rebellion failed, and Moray fled to England. Once Bothwell heard this, he came back to Scotland immediately and started racking up achievements. He was a man's man, macho, a tough guy, a bit reckless, maybe not the sharpest mind in the room, but definitely not one of those scheming, whispering courtiers. He was straightforward, loyal. At least that's how people saw him then. After the rebellion, Mary no longer had her trusted secretary and advisor, David Riccio. Moray came back from England and took charge of state affairs. But Mary did not entirely trust Moray. And so she became more and more dependent on Bothwell. Riccio was a strategic mind, leading the country with planning and foresight. Bothwell, on the other hand, ruled with brute force. He didn't bother trying to persuade people. He simply crushed the opposition and forced them into submission. He became, in effect, the dictator of Scotland, second only to one above all others. So the nobles who once helped kill Riccio ended up now regretting it. They thought they've gotten rid of a fox only to see a lion take its place. Could they not get rid of Bothwell like they did with Riccio? Not a chance. Bothwell was an accomplished warrior. He traveled everywhere with fully armed escorts. Taking him down by ambush was not an option. Now, he wasn't much to look at. Some say he was downright ugly. The portraits we have are probably very generous. But, nonetheless, he apparently had quite a way with women. Women seemed drawn to him. I guess he was the type of man brimming with testosterone. And when he sensed a woman liked him, he didn't woo, he didn't flirt, he just took her. And then, once he had his way with her, he left. He didn't chase women, but surprisingly, they chased him. Why? Maybe it was less about emotion and more about hormonal instinct, so to speak. As Schopenhauer said, women often love ugly men, but never an unmanly man. Mary was quite fond of him. He was a loyal supporter. She even arranged a marriage for him with Jean Gordon, who was a daughter of a wealthiest landowner in the Scottish Highlands. Jean wasn't exactly known for her looks, but apparently she had special talent in the bedroom. The details are vague, but from what we know, the marriage was generally a satisfactory one for both partners. Now up to this point, the relationship between Mary and the Earl of Bothwell might look like the perfect example of a loyal vassal and a generous queen. He was utterly devoted, and she rewarded him handsomely. But then, things changed. At some point, Bothwell and Mary started an affair. And not just any affair. Mary was clinging to Bothwell, begging for his attention. She was no longer the proud, strong woman she used to be. What happened? Had Mary lost herself in a storm of passion? The root of it might be her deep psychological distress. Her marriage to Darnley had pushed her into a deep depression. And depression doesn't just drain your spirit, it eats away at your self-esteem. Mary was so mentally weakened that she fell into something she would normally have resisted, a relationship driven by pure impulse and desire. And then, in Bothwell, the man who might actually be capable of getting rid of Darnley, she might have found what she thought was a way out of the trap. But what about Bothwell? Did he love the Queen? Being involved with the Queen was a dangerous game. If the truth came out, his enemies would pounce. And let's not forget, they were both married. Mary herself had recently signed a law. Adultery was now punishable by death. But, at the same time, the reward could be enormous. She was the Queen. Her favor comes with the promise of power. Risky, sure, but manageable, he thought, as long as no one found out. But then, something unexpected happened that escalated the situation. During a hunting trip, Bothwell got into a fight with another hunter and was seriously injured. And as soon as Mary heard this news, she went into a full panic mode. She pretended she was going hunting, but instead she rode straight to Bothwell's estate to check on him. His condition was so bad, the doctors couldn't even say if he'd make it. And when she returned from that so-called hunting trip, she collapsed. She vomited, lost her vision, had a raging fever, and eventually lost consciousness. The doctors were stumped. No one knew what was wrong, but then, and here's the wild part, she suddenly sprang back to life the moment she heard Bothwell was going to survive, just like that. And after this, Mary completely lost the brakes. She decided that she will marry Bothwell. Now, if Mary had even a shred of reason left, this idea never would have crossed her mind. Bothwell was of low status, a man with absolutely no right to any throne, and let's not forget, both of them were already married. They'd each have to take care of their spouses. It was a plan no sane person would attempt. But Mary wasn't thinking straight anymore. She promised kingship to Bothwell, and ambition can drive a man to do almost anything. Bothwell wasn't a complicated guy before. He was manly, loyal, lived with flair, didn't care what others thought. And now that he set his sights on the throne, he moved fast. Divorcing his wife? That could happen any time. The priority was getting rid of Darnley. But there was one problem. Darnley had holed up in Glasgow, too scared to move. So Bothwell made a reckless decision. He sent Mary to get him. Now, if she had any pride or concern for her dignity or safety, this was the last thing she should have done. But they wanted to end this quickly, and Mary was the only person who can make Darnley to come to Edinburgh. So she went, and shockingly, Darnley believed her. He had no idea he was walking straight into a trap. But to be fair, Darnley wasn't a total idiot. He knew Mary too well. He might have sensed something was off, but he believed that it was simply Mary's depression. And who is to blame for that but he himself? And as he kept asking for her forgiveness, she was also feeling guilty. She was luring him into a trap. She knew she was doing something unforgivable. She even wrote letters in which she poured her heart out. But the one she was worried about wasn't Darnley. It was Bothwell. She worried what Bothwell might think of her. She worried that Bothwell would one day despise her for everything she was doing for him. And then the explosion at Kirkhofield happened, and Darnley was killed. The man in charge of investigating the case was none other than Bothwell. The public was uneasy, but Bothwell's grip on power was so strong that no one dared to speak out. And soon after, Bothwell divorced his wife, and less than 2 weeks after his divorce, Mary married Bothwell just as they had planned. But really, now, the story you heard so far was one particularly scandalous version of the murder of Lord Darnley, based on a series of letters allegedly written by Mary to Bothwell. The letters, called the casket letters because they were found in a silver casket, which is a small box that once belonged to Mary. And these letters were used to accuse Mary of plotting Darnley's murder with Bothwell and to force her to abdicate her crown. But is any of that true? Many historians suspect that the casket letters were outright forgery made by the nobles who wanted Mary out of the way. Certainly, Mary herself insisted that they were forged. Some think the letters were Mary's, but with some crucial passages inserted into the original letter. Some others think the letters were written by someone else to Bothwell. And yet, some others think the letters were in fact genuine. But it is impossible to prove one way or the other because the original letters were destroyed. All we have now are the transcriptions and translations of the letters made by various people at various times for various purposes. But if the letters were forged or altered in any way, who would have done such a thing? Again, if we stick to the general guideline of look who benefited, one man stands out. Mary eventually ended up abdicating the throne in favor of her infant son, James VI, and the man who became the regent to rule on behalf of the infant king, Mary's half-brother, the Earl of Moray. And who was the person who made those casket letters public? None other than Moray. Historians question whether Mary was aware of the plot to kill Darnley, not to mention taking active role in it. Some say she knew the nobles wanted to kill Darnley, but she tried to discourage it, and thought they had given up. And some say Mary knew of the plot and turned a blind eye. And the story of her mad dash to see Bothwell after he was injured? The visit to Bothwell's castle was planned well before she heard anything about him being injured. And she did not show any particular hurry to visit him either. And when Mary did visit him, she was accompanied by her counselors and guards. It was only after Darnley had died that people started to talk about her visit as an evidence that Mary and Bothwell were having an affair while Darnley was still alive. So what happened to Mary and Bothwell? I mentioned that they got married after Bothwell divorced his wife. But was that the end of the story? Of course not. We will follow that story in our next video.